June 6, 1944. The English Channel, 23 kilometers off the French coast. Total darkness. Icy salt spray crashes over the steel bow of landing craft tank 2273, soaking everything in a freezing mist. Lieutenant Dean Rockwell grips the cold radio handset, his knuckles white. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he can just barely make out the ominous silhouettes of 32 amphibious Sherman tanks, their canvas screens erected like medieval siege towers against a jagged horizon. Then, the static clears. A message from Task Force O crackles through. H-hour confirmed. 0630 hours. The invasion is on. But as the light begins to bleed into the sky, the reality becomes terrifyingly clear. Beach obstacles are identified. Heavy fortifications remain perfectly intact. Captain Ned Elder of the 743rd Tank Battalion studies the deadly 5-foot swells through his binoculars. The rulebook says launch the swimming tanks now, but the ocean says that is suicide. In that moment, Elder makes a decision that will break protocol but save hundreds of American lives. The DD tanks will not swim. They will ride their landing craft all the way into the teeth of the enemy fire. What none of them knew was that this single, split-second decision made in the churning waters of Normandy would trigger the most devastating armored breakthrough in the history of the European theater. To understand why this decision was so critical, you have to understand the nightmare awaiting them. The hedgerows of France, the Bocage, had taught German forces that their Tigers and Panthers were apex predators. They possessed superior armor, devastating 88mm guns, and a mechanical precision that made them nearly invincible in defensive positions. The Wehrmacht's armored doctrine had turned the Norman countryside into a series of calculated kill zones. There were hundreds of concealed positions, anti-tank guns sighted on every possible approach, and tank traps designed to channel Allied armor into predetermined slaughter pens. Against this, the Sherman tank churned through the channel at just 4 knots. Its Chrysler A57 multibank engine, a Frankenstein monster of 5 car engines bolted together, strained against 33 tons of steel and determination. Each M4 Sherman displaced enough water to flood a small house when fitted with its duplex drive system. Staff Sergeant Paul Reagan stood exposed in the commander's hatch of his tank aboard LCT 600, scanning the horizon. His machine was a rolling bomb, carrying 90 rounds of 75mm high explosive ammunition, 4,750 rounds of .30 caliber machine gun ammo, and the desperate hopes of the entire amphibious assault. The Sherman represented American industrial philosophy at its most pragmatic. Consider the math. A German Tiger cost 250,000 Reichsmarks and required specialized maintenance crews. The Sherman, however, could be mass-produced, shipped across oceans, and fixed by farm boys from Kansas using basic wrenches. By 1944, Chrysler's Detroit tank arsenal alone was pumping out over 400 Shermans every single month. While Germany struggled to hand-build 100 Tigers monthly, American factories were churning out over 2,000 Shermans at peak production. When you factor in mechanical reliability, fuel consumption, and ease of repair, the equation wasn't just about firepower, it was about overwhelming logistics. Tank Commander William Bocage had trained for this exact moment with the 743rd Tank Battalion at Camp Laguna, Arizona. A veteran who would later earn a Silver Star and a Purple Heart, Bocage understood a fundamental truth of mechanized warfare that the spec sheets missed. Victory wasn't just about armor thickness or gun caliber. It was about putting steel on target, maintaining a relentless operational tempo, and most critically, adapting to battlefield chaos faster than the enemy could react. Meanwhile, waiting on the other side of the Atlantic Wall, the perspective was very different. Aboard Panther No. 424 of the 2nd Panzer Division, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber reviewed his loadout. He sat on a Predator. 79 rounds for the terrified long-barreled 75mm kilowatt K-42 gun. 4,200 rounds of machine gun ammunition. His Panther's frontal armor was 100mm thick, but sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 140mm. The math was simple. The American 75mm guns could not penetrate him beyond point-blank range, 100 meters. Weber's tank displaced 45 tons, powered by a massive Maybach HL 230P30 engine. It was a beast that consumed fuel at rates that would have horrified American logistics officers, 1 mile per gallon on roads, and half that cross-country. But today, fuel economy didn't matter. Positioned hull down in a Norman hedgerow with interlocking fields of fire, the Panther didn't need to move. It only needed to kill. The German defensive positions at Omaha Beach were the result of 2 years of obsessive fortification. Widerstandsness 62, Resistance Nest 62, overlooking the Easy Red sector, was a fortress. It contained multiple machine gun nests, a 50mm anti-tank gun, and mortar pits. Inside, Heinrich Severloh, manning a milligram 42 machine gun, waited. He would later claim to have fired over 12,000 rounds that day, a figure historians consider greatly exaggerated given the physical impossibility of barrel changes and cooling, but the horror of his position was real regardless of the specific count. The German kill zones were mathematically perfect. Overlapping fields of fire created zero dead space where attackers could hide. Pre-registered artillery coordinates meant that mortars could drop shells anywhere on the beach within 30 seconds of target identification. It was 0550, and the trap was set. June 6th. Captain Ned Elder stood on the heaving deck of LCT 2037, fighting to keep his footing as he observed the sea state through spray-soaked binoculars. The situation was critical. The waves were not merely choppy, they were measuring 5 to 6 feet, with an 18-knot wind whipping from the west. The canvas screens of the DD tanks, engineered to withstand only 3-foot seas, would collapse instantly in these conditions. The math was horrifyingly simple. Of the 64 Sherman DD tanks scheduled to swim ashore at Omaha Beach, only 29 would actually attempt it. And the tragedy of that attempt would play out immediately. Of those 29 tanks belonging to the 741st Tank Battalion on the eastern sectors, 27 would sink like stones in the freezing waters of the English Channel, taking their crews to the bottom. But Elder made the call that defied the playbook. His 743rd Tank Battalion would not launch into the sea. Instead, his 32 DD tanks and support vehicles would ride their LCTs directly onto the sands of Dog Green and Dog Red beaches. It meant exposing the thin-skinned landing craft to direct enemy fire, acting as massive, slow-moving targets. But the alternative was watching his tanks disappear beneath the waves before the battle even began. The mathematics of the decision was stark: risk the naval crews to save the army firepower, or lose everything before firing a shot. At 0615, the horizon erupted. The naval bombardment commenced with earth-shattering force. The USS Texas fired massive 14-inch shells at the bluffs above Omaha, joined by the 12-inch guns of the USS Arkansas. Smaller destroyers crept dangerously close, within 1,000 yards of the beach, firing directly into visible fortifications. On paper, this bombardment was supposed to last 40 minutes and pulverize German positions before the first boot touched the sand. In reality, it was a catastrophic failure. Most shells overshot their targets, exploding uselessly inland. To make matters worse, low cloud cover forced the heavy bombers to delay their release to avoid hitting their own invasion fleet. Their payloads fell harmlessly into the empty fields miles behind the beach defenses. Of the 446 B-24 Liberators that attacked Omaha Beach that morning, not a single bomb fell on the beach itself. The infantry would be walking into a meat grinder that was virtually untouched. The Sherman's first combat action at Omaha came at 0629, exactly 1 minute before H hour. Company A of the 743rd, fitted with deep wading equipment, rolled directly off the ramps of their LCTs into 4 feet of churning water. These weren't swimming tanks anymore. They were wading monsters, waterproofed with special kits and fitted with improvised exhaust stacks that allowed them to breathe while submerged in 6 feet of surf. The first tanks hit the beach with wet tracks grinding violently against the shingle, their 75mm guns instantly swinging toward the bluffs. The German response was immediate and devastating. An 88mm anti-tank gun positioned in Widerstandsness 61 fired 8 rounds in just 90 seconds. The results were horrific. 3 Shermans exploded instantly, their 75mm ammunition cooking off in spectacular, towering fireballs that could be seen clearly by the horrified crews on the naval vessels offshore. Machine gun fire sparked off the tank hulls like hellish rain, while mortars walked their explosions across the beach, bracketing the tanks with methodical, terrifying precision. But despite the chaos, the Shermans kept coming. By 0700, 40 tanks were fighting on Omaha Beach. Some were already burning wrecks, others had thrown their tracks on obstacles or bogged down in the loose shingle. But those still operational began engaging German positions with direct fire. The psychological impact was immediate. German infantry, trained to expect a soft infantry assault, suddenly found themselves staring down armor that could shrug off machine gun fire and respond with high explosive fury. Technical Sergeant John Ducoin of the 743rd landed in the second wave at 0640. His war started instantly. His tank took 2 direct hits from a 50mm anti-tank gun. The sound inside the hull must have been deafening. Both rounds penetrated the armor but miraculously missed the critical components and the crew. Ducoin's driver, Private First Class Howard Froberg, didn't retreat. He drove directly at the flash of the German gun. As they charged, the gunner pumped 5 rounds of high explosive straight into the fortification. The anti-tank gun fell silent. This became the pattern of the morning. With saltwater having destroyed most of the radios, coordination was impossible. Individual tank commanders fought private wars against specific German positions. A Sherman would absorb multiple hits from smaller caliber weapons, using its armor as a shield, while methodically dismantling machine gun nests with its 75mm main gun and the bow-mounted .30 caliber machine gun. That bow gunner position, unique to American tanks, proved invaluable, spraying suppressive fire at the trenches while the main gun cracked open the concrete bunkers. By 0730, the crisis at Omaha Beach was visible to everyone, from the lowest private to the highest commanders. From the bridge of the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley watched the slaughter unfold. The situation was so dire that he seriously considered aborting the operation and diverting the follow-up waves to Utah Beach. The reports coming in were apocalyptic. The 16th Infantry Regiment had taken catastrophic casualties. Company A had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Company E was down to just 23 men from an original strength of 180. The beach itself was a graveyard of destroyed equipment, with wounded men desperately seeking cover behind the very obstacles the Germans had placed to kill them. But amidst the carnage, the tanks were starting to make a difference. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Plodger, commanding the 743rd Tank Battalion, directed his Company C tanks to engage the fortifications at the Les Moulins Draw. They utilized a brutal technique developed in training: fire white phosphorus rounds to mark the targets, then hammer them with high explosives. The white phosphorus, known as Willy Pete, had a terrifying secondary effect. Its burning particles and choking smoke penetrated vision slits and gun ports, forcing the German defenders to abandon their positions or burn alive. At 0815, a frantic message from Widerstandsnis 66 reached the German sector command: enemy tanks on beach. Infantry decimated but tanks advancing. Request immediate anti-tank support. The response from headquarters was sobering. There were no mobile reserves available. The 352nd Infantry Division's anti-tank battalion was positioned 10 miles inland, held back by Field Marshal Rommel's strict orders to defend against expected airborne landings that weren't there. The beach defenders were on their own. They would have to hold with what they had. This is where the Sherman's mechanical simplicity proved to be a decisive weapon. Take the tank named Barbara of Company B, 743rd, commanded by Sergeant Walter Basker. In the first hour alone, it took 7 hits from various weapons. The damage was extensive. The tank lost 2 bogey wheels, the turret traverse mechanism was smashed, and it suffered a dangerous fuel leak. In a German Tiger, this would have been a mission kill requiring a factory reset. But the American crew made field repairs right there in the kill zone, using basic tools and spare parts strapped to the hull. By 0900, Barbara was back in action, engaging German positions at the Vierville Draw. This highlighted the Sherman's greatest advantage. A damaged Tiger or Panther required specialized recovery vehicles, heavy cranes, and highly trained mechanics to fix. A Sherman, however, could be repaired by its own crew using parts cannibalized from knocked-out tanks nearby. Throughout D-Day, Sherman crews performed miracles of field maintenance. Tracks were replaced while under sniper fire. Gun components damaged by shell hits were swapped out in 20 minutes. Engines that should have required depot-level overhauls were coaxed back to life with duct tape, improvisation, and sheer determination. At 0845, the complexion of the battle changed. The first German armor appeared. Two Stu G3 assault guns from the 352nd Infantry Division engaged the Shermans at a range of 800 meters. Their low-profile silhouettes and powerful 75mm Stu K40 guns made them lethal. They could penetrate the Shermans' frontal armor easily at that distance. But the American tanks had the one advantage that technology couldn't match: numbers. For every German assault gun, there were 5 Shermans. The Stu GS managed to destroy 2 American tanks, but the victory was short-lived. They were quickly overwhelmed by concentrated, rapid fire from multiple angles. By 0900, the stalemate broke with a bang. Combat engineers, working under withering fire but supported by the surviving tanks, had finally blown clear gaps in the concrete seawall at the Easy Red sector. This was the turning point. Shermans began clanking off the treacherous shingle and moving inland, finally able to engage German positions from the flank rather than head-on. This movement was catastrophic for the defenders. German defensive doctrine relied entirely on keeping the attackers pinned on the beach. Once Allied armor penetrated the perimeter, the entire defensive system began to unravel. Private First Class Charles Lombardo of the 741st Tank Battalion was a statistical anomaly. He had survived the disastrous swim to shore in one of only 2 DD tanks from his unit that didn't sink. His tank was waterlogged, smelling of salt and fear, and barely functional. Yet, Lombardo managed to engage a concrete bunker at 100 meters. He fired 5 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition to crack the shell, followed immediately by high explosives to gut the interior. That single bunker had been pinning down an entire infantry company. With its destruction, 150 infantrymen rose from the sand and moved off the beach. The German response to this armored breakthrough followed their established handbook. Panzerfaust teams were deployed to establish lethal close-range ambushes. The Panzerfaust, a disposable, single-shot anti-tank weapon, was a terrifying threat in this terrain. It could penetrate 200 millimeters of armor at 30 meters. In the Bocage country behind Omaha Beach, a maze of sunken roads and ancient, thick hedgerows, every corner could conceal a tank-killing team. But the Americans had learned their lesson in blood. The disasters at Kasserine Pass and Sicily had taught them that tanks cannot survive alone. Infantry-tank cooperation had been drilled into them relentlessly. Every Sherman advancing inland now had infantry walking alongside, using their eyes and rifles to check every hedge and building for anti-tank teams before the armor moved up. In the days following D-Day, the challenge would escalate. German armor would arrive in force. Panthers from the 2nd Panzer Division and Tigers from the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion would soon engage American tanks near vital objectives like Curren and Villers Bocage. The pattern of these future engagements would be consistent and bloody. Individually, the German tanks were superior machines, but American tactics emphasized fire and maneuver. While one Sherman platoon engaged a Tiger frontally, essentially acting as bait, another would aggressively maneuver for flank shots against the thinner side armor. The mathematics were brutal but effective. Trading 3 Shermans for 1 Panther was considered an acceptable exchange rate when American factories were producing 30 Shermans for every single Panther Germany could build. By noon on D-Day, 51 Sherman tanks were operational on Omaha Beach and its immediate inland areas. They had suffered terrible losses. 40% of the force had been knocked out, drowned, or disabled, but they had achieved their mission. The beach was secured. Follow-up waves were landing without taking catastrophic casualties. Most critically, the psychological impact on German forces was decisive. The myth of the impregnable Atlantic Wall had been shattered. At the 352nd Infantry Division headquarters, General Dietrich Krase listened to the fragmentary reports coming in with growing dread. American tanks were overwhelming the beach defenses. The Widerstandsnester, the resistance nests, were falling one by one. And now, enemy armor was advancing on Colville. The invasion had succeeded. By 1300, General Dietrich Krase, commanding the German 352nd Infantry Division, understood the grim reality. Omaha Beach was lost. With no armor reserves available to counter the surging American tanks, his infantry had no choice but to conduct a fighting withdrawal. But the Sherman tanks' impact extended far beyond direct combat. Their mere presence changed the physics of the battlefield. It allowed combat engineers to approach and clear obstacles without being massacred by machine gun fire. Their 75mm guns could engage hardened fortifications that naval gunfire simply couldn't reach or identify. Most importantly, the psychological effect on the American infantry was transformative. Soldiers who had been paralyzed by fear on the shingle, pinned down for hours, began to stand up and advance the moment they saw the reassuring silhouette of a Sherman moving forward. Technical innovations implemented specifically for D-Day were proving their worth. The deep wading equipment, developed in total secrecy and tested in the rough waters of Scotland, allowed tanks to land in deeper water, bypassing the worst of the obstacle belts. Waterproofed ammunition storage prevented catastrophic explosions when tanks took hits in the surf. And perhaps most critical for coordination was a low-tech addition: armored telephones mounted on the rear decks of the tanks. This allowed infantrymen to crouch behind the armor and talk directly to the tank crews, coordinating fire despite the widespread loss of radios. By 1400 on D-Day, American tanks were pushing inland toward their objectives. However, the advance was grindingly slower than planned. The reason was the terrain. What had looked like simple field boundaries on aerial reconnaissance photos proved to be formidable, ancient fortifications known as the Bocage. These weren't just hedges. They were earthen walls, some dating back to Roman times, 3 to 4 feet thick at the base, topped with dense, tangled vegetation and fronted by drainage ditches. Tanks attempting to climb over them exposed their thin, vulnerable belly armor to anti-tank fire. It was a tactical nightmare, but American ingenuity was already at work. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron saw a solution where others saw a problem. He noticed that the German beach obstacles, the steel hedgehogs designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft, could be cut up and repurposed. A soldier from Tennessee named Roberts had suggested the idea bluntly: "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Cullen recognized the brilliance in this simple observation. Within hours, maintenance crews were firing up welding torches, modifying tanks with these improvised hedge cutters that would later become legendary. Meanwhile, the German High Command's response to the Normandy landings was paralyzed by confusion and, fatally, by Hitler's personal intervention. The Führer was convinced that Normandy was merely a feint, a distraction, and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. Consequently, he refused to release the Strategic Armor Reserve. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, heavily armed and sitting 130 miles from Normandy, wasn't released until late afternoon. By the time they could mobilize, American armor had already established blocking positions on all major approaches to the beachhead. At 1,600 hours, the reality of armored warfare hit home. Company B of the 743rd Tank Battalion encountered its first Tiger I tank near the village of Formigny. The Tiger, belonging to the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, had been dispatched from its position near Curren to halt the American advance. Its commander, SS Unterscharführer Wilhelm Müller, was a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, a survivor of the Battle of Kursk where his crew had destroyed 19 Soviet T-34s. He knew his machine was superior. His 88mm kilowatt K-36 gun could punch through a Sherman at 2,000 meters, long before the Americans could even scratch his paint. But the engagement demonstrated the rapid tactical evolution American tankers had undergone. Instead of committing suicide by engaging the Tiger head-on, the Sherman platoon leader, Lieutenant James Johnson, ordered smoke rounds fired immediately to blind the German heavy. While one Sherman maintained suppressing fire to keep the German crew distracted, 3 others aggressively maneuvered through a small orchard to the flank. The Tiger, focused on the lone Sherman to its front, didn't notice the flanking movement until it was too late. At a range of just 200 meters, the Sherman gunners pumped 5 rounds into the Tiger's thinner rear armor and engine compartment. The massive 57-ton beast shuddered to a halt, black smoke pouring from its rear deck. Müller's crew bailed out of their burning machine, but the psychological impact of that kill rippled through the German forces. If even the mighty Tigers could be destroyed by Shermans, what chance did the infantry have? Reports reaching German command painted an increasingly dire picture. Enemy tank strength overwhelming, multiple Tiger and Panther losses, infantry retreating from armored spearheads. The reality, of course, was more nuanced. For every successful flanking attack, Shermans paid a heavy price in frontal engagements. But American doctrine accepted these losses as part of the equation. The Sherman was designed to be good enough, not perfect. It was a triumph of logistics over ego. It could be transported by standard Liberty ships, 2 Shermans fitting in the space required for 1 Tiger. It could be maintained by conscript mechanics with 3 months of training. And most importantly, it could be produced in numbers that made losses acceptable. In the end, the perfection of German engineering was buried under an avalanche of American steel. By 1800 hours on D-Day, as the sun began to dip low over the smoking ruins of the French coast, the 743rd and 741st Tank Battalions had done the impossible. They had established a continuous, steel-reinforced line inland from Omaha Beach. The butcher's bill for this achievement was steep. 48 tanks had been destroyed or disabled, with 45 crew members killed and another 60 wounded. But the gamble had paid off. They had successfully put 58 operational tanks ashore and, effectively, broken the back of the Atlantic Wall. German casualties were harder to quantify in the chaos, but the devastation was clear. Multiple fortified positions had been cracked open, 3 assault guns were knocked out, and reports claimed the destruction of 1 Tiger and 3 Panthers, along with hundreds of infantry casualties. The technological lessons of the day were immediately apparent. The Sherman's 75mm gun, often criticized for its inability to penetrate heavy German armor frontally, proved to be devastatingly effective in its intended role, an infantry support weapon. It cracked bunkers and suppressed infantry where naval gunfire simply couldn't reach. But the real surprise was reliability. Despite saltwater immersion, navigating mine-laden beach obstacles, and enduring intense combat, 70% of the Shermans that physically made it ashore were still operational at day's end. Compare that to the German logistical nightmare. Of the 6 Tiger IIS, the fearsome King Tigers, deployed to Normandy in July, 5 would break down due to mechanical failure before ever reaching combat. The Sherman might not have been a duel winner, but it was a war winner. On the night of June 6 to 7th, while the infantry tried to sleep in their foxholes, American maintenance crews worked feverishly through the darkness. The blue light of acetylene torches flickered against the night sky. In a stroke of brilliant improvisation, they began cutting up the very German beach obstacles designed to stop them, the steel beams and hedgehogs, and welded them to the bows of the Shermans. By dawn on June 7th, 15 tanks had been modified with these crude but effective hedge cutters. Within a week, 60% of American tanks in Normandy would carry these Rhino devices, so named because the jagged steel prongs resembled the horns of a rhinoceros. The impact was undeniable. The German 352nd Infantry Division's war diary for June 7th recorded a grim entry. Enemy tank attacks supported by massive artillery have made defensive positions untenable. Withdrawal to 2nd Defensive Line authorized. This wasn't just a retreat. It represented a fundamental collapse of German defensive doctrine. The Atlantic Wall hadn't just been breached, it had been rendered obsolete by American armor. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the First Army, would later write with absolute conviction, "The tanks saved Omaha Beach. Without them, we would have been thrown back into the sea." This wasn't hyperbole. The 29 infantry companies that assaulted Omaha Beach suffered horrific 50% casualties. Yet the 2 tank battalions, despite their own heavy losses, maintained their offensive capability throughout the day. Their presence turned a potential disaster into a costly but decisive victory. The weeks following D-Day would see the full, terrifying maturity of American armored doctrine. It would culminate in Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th. This operation would showcase combined arms tactics on a scale never seen before. 3,000 aircraft would carpet bomb German positions, turning the landscape into a moonscape. Then, 700 Shermans, 60% of them equipped with Sergeant Cullen's Rhino hedge cutters, would punch through the suffocating Bocage. The breakthrough would transform the Normandy stalemate into a chaotic war of movement, exactly the kind of fight American armor was built to win. Within just 6 weeks of D-Day, the technological landscape of the battlefield had shifted. Over 500 Shermans were modified with various hedge-cutting devices, while the British developed their own variation known as prongs. The innovation spread so rapidly that by August, German intelligence sent a panicked report up the chain of command: all enemy tanks now equipped with hedge-breaking devices. Bocage defensive positions no longer tenable. The deadlock of the hedgerows had been broken by welding torches and ingenuity. Despite this, the German Panther tank remained technically superior throughout the campaign. Its high-velocity 75mm gun could punch through Sherman armor at ranges where the American rounds would simply bounce off. But technical superiority on paper couldn't overcome the realities of war: numerical inferiority, logistical strangulation, and mechanical fragility. A study by the British Operational Research Section found a damning statistic. In Normandy, Panthers had an operational availability of just 37%. The Sherman, a reliable 70%. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable and cruel. Germany struggled to produce approximately 6,000 Panthers throughout the entire war. America churned out 49,234 Shermans, nearly 50,000 when including all variants. In Normandy alone, over 2,000 Shermans would see combat. Even if the Germans achieved a 3-to-1 kill ratio, which they rarely managed in the chaos of retreat, they couldn't stem the tide. For every Panther destroyed, 5 Shermans appeared on the horizon. For every Tiger lost, 10 fresh Shermans rolled off the ramps at Normandy's artificial mulberry harbors. By August 1944, the German armored forces in Normandy were effectively annihilated. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had entered combat with 180 tanks, was reduced to a ghost force of just 25. The 116th Panzer Division fell from 120 tanks to barely a dozen. Even the vaunted 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, could muster only 17 operational tanks from an initial strength of 150. The end came in the Falaise Pocket in mid-August, the killing ground that saw the final destruction of German armor in Normandy. Squeezed between British, Canadian, Polish, and American forces, the discipline of the Wehrmacht collapsed. German tank crews abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. Allied pilots flying overhead reported roads littered with miles of burning Tigers and Panthers, their crews unable to maintain or fuel these mechanical monsters during the desperate retreat. However, American losses were also severe. The 743rd Tank Battalion alone lost 51 tanks totally destroyed in the Normandy campaign, with another 80 requiring major repairs. Crew casualties exceeded 50%. But unlike the Germans, American losses were instantly replaced. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 arrived from England. For every crew member killed, 3 replacements were already in the pipeline. The human cost, however, was sobering. Tank warfare in the Bocage was particularly brutal and intimate. The average distance of a tank engagement was just 400 meters, knife fighting range for heavy armor. At that distance, the first shot usually meant the first kill. Living with these odds, tank crews developed a dark, fatalistic humor to cope with the reality of their war. The Sherman lights the first time, every time. The crews would joke with dark irony, referencing the popular advertising slogan for Ronson-lighters. They called them Tommy Cookers. But beneath the gallows humor, they knew a deeper truth. Their sacrifice was the fuel enabling the Allied victory. Private First Class Wayne Robinson of Company B, 743rd Tank Battalion, captured this sentiment perfectly in his later writings about his tank, affectionately named Barbara. He wrote, "She wasn't the best tank in the world. The Germans had better, but she was there when we needed her. She took us through hell and got us home. That's all you can ask of a tank or a friend." The technological evolution continued relentlessly throughout the campaign. The British Sherman Firefly, mounting the massive 17-pounder gun capable of penetrating Tiger armor at 1,000 meters, began arriving in significant numbers. By August, the math had changed. 1 in 4 British Shermans was a Firefly, giving every platoon a distinct lethal edge. American units also began receiving Shermans armed with the high-velocity 76mm gun starting in July. While still arguably inferior to the German Big Cats in raw power, it gave American crews a fighting chance. But the greatest innovation remained tactical, not technical. American armored doctrine emphasized combined arms, mobility, and mass. Tanks never operated alone. They were the iron fist of an integrated team that included infantry, artillery, combat engineers, and overwhelming air support. This systematic approach to warfare proved more decisive than any individual weapon system ever could. The legendary German tank ace Otto Carius, who is credited with destroying over 150 enemy tanks on the Eastern Front, would later summarize this bitter reality. He wrote, "The Americans understood something we didn't. War isn't about having the best tank. It's about having enough good tanks, fuel to run them, parts to fix them, and men trained to use them. We had the best tanks. They had everything else." Statistical analysis conducted after the war revealed the true story of tank combat in Normandy, debunking the death trap myth. The average Sherman in combat was hit 1.2 times. Of those hit, 60% were knocked out permanently, 20% were repairable in the field, and 20% required depot-level maintenance. However, crew survival rates were surprisingly high. 75% of Sherman crew members survived their tank being destroyed. This was partly due to the Sherman's spring-loaded, large hatches which allowed for rapid exit, and partly due to the American emphasis on crew escape training. German tanks showed a darker pattern. Panthers required an average of 2.3 penetrations before total destruction, suggesting they could indeed absorb more punishment. But once hit, 80% were permanent losses, largely due to the inability to recover and repair vehicles during a retreat. Most horrifyingly, Tiger crews had only a 45% survival rate when their tanks were destroyed. This was often due to catastrophic ammunition fires and heavy, screw-down hatches that were slow to open in an emergency. The Normandy campaign transformed American armored warfare forever. Lessons learned in the blood-soaked Bocage would be applied across Europe. The crude hedge cutters evolved into standardized dozer blades. Tank infantry phones became standard factory equipment. Most importantly, the mythology of German armored superiority was shattered. American tankers learned they could defeat Tigers and Panthers not with magic, but through superior tactics, flanking maneuvers, and teamwork. By late August 1944, as Allied forces broke out across France, the strategic impact was clear. Germany had lost not just a battle, but the capacity to conduct mobile warfare in the West. The cream of the Panzer forces lay burned out in the Norman fields. Experienced crews who had survived the horrors of Russia were now dead or captured in France. The training schools in Germany couldn't possibly replace such a loss of institutional knowledge. The Sherman tank would continue to be criticized by armchair historians focused solely on technical specifications. Yes, its armor was thinner than German tanks. Yes, its gun was less powerful. Yes, its gasoline engine was arguably more flammable than diesel alternatives. All these criticisms were valid in isolation. But war isn't fought in isolation. The Sherman was part of a system, industrial, logistical, and tactical, that proved vastly superior to the German alternatives. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, the Allied naval commander for D-Day, would later observe, the success at Normandy wasn't due to any single weapon or tactic. It was the culmination of Allied industrial might, logistical superiority, and tactical adaptation. The Sherman tank embodied all these qualities. It was not perfect, but it was perfectly adequate for the task at hand. The long-term impact of this philosophy extended far beyond World War II. The Sherman success validated a uniquely American military doctrine, emphasizing production quantity, mechanical reliability, and tactical flexibility over technical perfection. This philosophy would influence American tank design throughout the Cold War. The M48 pattern, the M60, and even the early versions of the M1 Abrams prioritized these same qualities. The German military theorist Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, would write perhaps the most stinging admission in his memoirs: "We made the perfect tank. The Americans made the tank that won the war." There is a timeless lesson in that for all military planners, perfect is the enemy of good enough, especially when good enough can be produced in overwhelming numbers that blot out the sun. The memorial at Omaha Beach today includes a preserved Sherman tank from the 743rd Tank Battalion. If you look closely, Its hull still bears the jagged scars from German shells. Fresh flowers are regularly placed on its tracks by French civilians who still remember the liberation. The memorial's inscription is haunting, "To those who came in steel coffins to give us freedom." It is a fitting tribute to the citizen soldiers who climbed into technically inferior tanks and made them superior through sheer courage, innovation, and sacrifice. In the final analysis, the Sherman tank's success at Normandy and beyond wasn't about armor thickness or gun caliber. It was about an American industrial capacity capable of producing 1,000 tanks monthly. It was about farm boys from the Midwest maintaining complex machinery under mortar fire. It was about tactical innovations like the Rhino hedge cutter that transformed battlefield dynamics overnight. Most fundamentally, it was about the arsenal of democracy proving a cold, hard truth: that quantity has a quality all its own. The numbers tell the story. In June 1944, the disparity was staggering. Across all active fronts, the entire Third Reich could muster approximately 1,500 operational tanks. In that same month, America alone didn't just match that number. They exceeded it, rolling 2,000 fresh Shermans off the assembly lines. By August, the gap had become an abyss. Allied forces in Northwest Europe fielded 4,000 tanks against fewer than 500 German defenders. The mathematics of modern industrial warfare had rendered tactical superiority irrelevant. The Tiger might win the individual battles, but the Sherman had already won the war. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, had argued vainly for positioning panzer reserves near the beaches. He was proven tragically correct in his assessment. In personal papers discovered after his forced suicide in October 1944, he had written a prediction that reads like an epitaph for the German army: "The Americans will come with thousands of tanks. Not better than ours, but thousands. We cannot stop thousands." The war is lost when the first American tank rolls off the beach. On June 6, 1944, at exactly 0629 hours, Rommel's nightmare became reality. The first Sherman tanks of Company A, 743rd Tank Battalion, rolled off the landing craft and onto the sands of Normandy. At that precise moment, the war in the West was effectively decided. Hundreds of thousands would still die in the bitter fighting to come, but the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. The Sherman tank, imperfect, mass-produced, and manned by citizen soldiers, had cracked the Atlantic Wall and begun the liberation of Europe. The legacy of those 12 hours on June 6 would rewrite military doctrine for generations. Every major power would study the lessons of Normandy and reach the same conclusion. In modern warfare, industrial capacity, logistical superiority, and tactical adaptation matter far more than technical specifications. The Sherman tank had not just won a battle, it had validated an entire approach to warfare. Deep in the soil of Normandy today, the evidence still rests where it fell. Tigers and Panthers, engineering marvels that represented the absolute pinnacle of 1940s tank design, slowly rust away in silence. Their crews, some of the most skilled and experienced tank soldiers in history, died manning weapons that were individually superior but collectively insufficient. They were honored by both sides for their skill and courage. But their sacrifice marked the end of an era when tactical brilliance could overcome strategic disadvantage. The future belonged to nations capable of mass production, rapid innovation, and the systematic application of combined arms warfare. The Sherman tank, for all its flaws and critics, represented these qualities perfectly. It wasn't the best tank of World War II, but it was the tank that won World War II. And in the cold, hard arithmetic of modern warfare, that is the only statistic that truly matters.